I do work for the Electric Cooperatives of South Carolina. We serve 1.5 million people. We serve 70% of the state's land mass. We've been around since 1939. There are 20 different cooperatives that serve that 1.5 million people. We're the only state in the country where every county in the state is served by electric cooperatives. We don't own generation. We buy energy output from Santee Cooper, a state-owned utility. We are Duke Energy's single largest wholesale customer in the United States. It sets us free to make some decisions about how we sell electricity to our member owners because we don't have plant and equipment sitting there that we have to worry about using enough of it. So one of the things we've looked at is, as a replacement for generation, is really energy efficiency. If you have certainty in your energy efficiency, if you know what's going to be there, you can depend on it just like you can a nuclear plant or a coal plant, wind, solar, whatever. So that's where we're heading now. We're doing some innovative things. I want to share with you a little bit, though, about my people, my co-op people, the people we serve. It's a state I grew up in. It's a state I love a lot. In 1939, prior to the electric cooperatives coming to South Carolina, the Writers Project came through as part of the New Deal and interviewed people about what was it like to live in South Carolina. They interviewed a man near my hometown of Clover, South Carolina, and they said, what is the single greatest invention of your lifetime? Think it would be the airplane, a car, whatever. The guy, this is a true story, said screen wire, because finally you could keep the bugs out. And hearing my dad now, my dad's nearly 80, talk about growing up feeding chickens through the cracks in the floor as they ran around underneath. In 1939, there were a lot of places that were purely rural. If you think about Hilton Head Island, how many folks have been to Hilton Head? That's served by an electric cooperative. The reason the co-op's serving is because they tossed a coin in the 1950s between South Carolina Electric Gas and the cooperatives. And the loser had to take Hilton Head Island. There were 12 African-American farm families that lived on that island then. There was no way you're going to sell enough electricity to ever make your money back. But the co-op did it. They sold those families those $10 memberships and went there. Sometimes you do the right thing and God up above will reward you, you know. There is a lot going on in South Carolina today that's a little bit different than that. That was a real calamity in the 30s in terms of people not having electricity. Less than 2% of rural families in South Carolina, less than 2% had electricity prior to electric cooperatives. Cooperatives tossed them a lifeline to pull them in. In some ways, though, that lifeline has become an anvil, and that's what I want to talk about today. Giving folks electricity and not giving them more can create a real downward pull on them and their families and their economics. I want to do a poll of the audience and see, some of you don't have to raise your hand, I'll tell you which ones. Who in here is a college graduate? Raise your hand. Keep your hands up if you've got a higher degree than that. My folks, my people, we have the 5th highest functional illiteracy rate in the country. So if you try to work with them to do something different, better, you're gonna have to be pretty innovative about how you do it. I'm not gonna ask your age, but I will tell you, I heard earlier about the elderly. 22% of my people are over 65 compared to the national average of 13. Housing. There is great manufactured housing. I'm gonna use the right word rather than mobile home or wobbly box or whatever. And there's poor manufactured housing. We have a lot of the poor manufactured housing. If I have my numbers right, 6.4% of housing in the United States is manufactured housing. 24% of the houses we serve is manufactured housing in South Carolina, 4 times the national average. Many of these have been moved a number of times. We do thermal imaging on cold nights, and you can go out and see where a double wide has not been joined together. And literally you've got a space, a hot spot, where you can see the hot air coming out into the cold. 70% of those mobile homes have strip heating, strip resistance heating. And if you're not familiar with strip resistance heating, think about being cold in your house and you decide you're gonna get warm by turning your hairdryer on you. Because that's essentially what it is. It's forcing air over a coil. It's very, very energy inefficient. In fact, January 2010 We had single-wide mobile homes where the bill was between $800 and $900 for that month. And that's at 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Essentially, that heater was running all the time on an emergency heat. These are for folks, between that electric bill and their gasoline bill in January 2010, they were spending almost 80% of their take-home income on energy. Couldn't afford it. Of those manufactured homes, 35% of them were built before 1990, 54% before 1995. Not going to ask you to raise your hand on this one either, but think about your income, what you make. If you're a South Carolina co-op member, my people, you're 50% more likely to live under the federal poverty level than the average American. 26 of South Carolina counties, 12 of 46, qualify as persistent poverty counties, meaning their poverty rate has been 20% or greater since 1970. So if your business plan is a cooperative and you're owned by your members you sell to and they have the right to vote, if your business plan is to sell more, at some point you're throwing an anvil to your people. When I was 15 years old, I drove a school bus in York County, South Carolina. About a mile and a half from my house, I made 3 stops and picked up 54 children. When those children got on the bus, even on cold days, I would have to leave the window open where I sat. They had heated their homes with wood, they couldn't afford the electricity, and they didn't have running water, and you could imagine the odor. Those homes are still that way. When I go home to visit my parents, I can go by there and still see those homes that way. They can't afford to do anything about it. Nobody's helping. You have internet access? Hold your hand up. 33% of my people don't. Do you live in a rural area? How many folks in here live in a rural area? Nobody? 63% of my folks do, 3 times the national average of 21%. As we do a retrofit program, our goal is to go into a home, do a Building Performance Institute BPI audit. We assess what needs to be done, and usually it's one of 2 things. Either you need to tighten up the envelope, and/or you need to replace that strip resistance heat with a new heat pump, or the third option is replace an older heat pump with a newer heat pump. We do that audit. It pushes out a report, 2 reports in fact. One is a very technical report for the retrofit specialist to come in and work from. The other one is a consumer-friendly report that explains here's what needs to happen in your home in order to get it up to speed. We sit down, our co-op people sit down with the homeowner or landlord tenants. We do both, landlord tenant and homeowner. And we describe, here's what we think we can do with your home. We have an approved list of contractors that we would like to have come in. You can pick from them, it's your choice. But if you'll do this list, we'll pay for that work. And we'll tell you what the predicted savings is for your home. And in month 1, you get to keep 1/3 of those savings in your pocket. 2/3 goes to pay off the debt on your power bill, on-bill financing. South Carolina has a 2-year-old on-bill financing statute that really works well. It works well in part because you do an audit up front that says, here's what needs to be done. The work is done. And what I think is the really innovative thing is that same auditor comes back on the back end, audits again to make sure the work was done right. And within our program, we've had to have contractors come back 2 or 3 times, but when they're finally through, it's done right. And that homeowner can depend on he got his money's worth. Why do we want to do it? It helps our members. Remember I told you that energy efficiency is a substitute for generation. Full scale, our program, we're trying to reach about 225,000 homes over a 10-year period. Combining that with demand side management, we're going to avoid building half of a nuclear unit or $4 billion. So that $4 billion helps every co-op member. But those homes that we will retrofit will save $270 million a year in their pockets. And these homes tend to be in those persistent poverty counties. Creates jobs where you hadn't seen a new job created in a long, long time. But there are challenges to this program. Beyond the demographics, there's a lot of confusion. Weatherization has gotten a black eye. You hear about programs that have been run in a sloppy way, and I don't want to fault government or anything in particular, but they just weren't run well. And the media picks up on it. So when you go into a homeowner's home and you say, we want to help you, you better mean it, and you better stand behind those audits. The average cooperative in South Carolina, that's a Touchstone member, which is our brand, has an 87 ACSI score, which is a customer satisfaction index score. It's not a fake one like some of them. The average IOU in the country has a 72. So that consumer confidence in the co-ops is there, and we can use it to our advantage, but you sure don't want to do anything that sends it in the wrong way. So you have confusion, but you can overcome that with an effective co-op presence. There's a lack of confidence and access sometimes for weatherization, letting that contractor in the home, letting the auditor in the home. But again, the co-op helps overcome that. Your special guest that's going to be here in about 20 minutes is helping us overcome the third one and the major one, and that's the lack of capital. These individual homeowners don't have the capital to do it. But if you look around at where you're going to get capital, I've had plenty of people come see me for-profits and say, if you'll cut off, which if you use your own bill finance, you'll have a covenant to cut off if they don't pay. We'll lend you money at 11%. You can't make this program work at that level. Currently, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, under their Red Leg program, has a loan program that we're the first in the nation. 0% loan over 10 years, and we lend that money out at 2.5%. The program that Congressman Clyburn is going to talk about, I hope, is a bigger model of that. Still 0% interest loans over 10 years. It's a hand up, it's not a handout, and it does work. I told you earlier we're targeting 200,000 of our 700,000 homes. Here's what we've already found. We target return on investment such that it's 6.6 years or less. And we look at each retrofit strategy when we go in and test with the audit, and if it pays back within 6.6 years, we're willing to fund it and pay the contractor. We thought that was a pretty aggressive target. What we've actually found so far is that the average payback is 5.8 years with those strategies like the retrofit of the heat pump and tightening up the envelope. We also find that over the year, each year after we're fully built out on the scale, we're going to reduce GHG emissions by 2.4 million metric tons a year, greenhouse gases. This has got all kind of good sides to it. It creates jobs, it's good for the environment, it's good for the homeowner, it's good for all co-op members. Some folks have recognized this. The Doris Duke Foundation in 2010 had a competition for energy efficiency grant proposals. They wanted to study energy efficiency in depth. We were approached by the Environment and Energy Study Institute of Washington, D.C., which frequently briefs Congress through the Congressional Research Service on energy matters. EESI, Carol Werner's group, asked to partner with us. So we became one of 400 applications to the Doris Duke Foundation to study energy efficiency. When they were announced, we were one of 9 that was awarded. At that same time, folks in California, at the University of California, Davis, heard about our program. They approached us. They wanted to compete in the Doris Duke Foundation grant process as well. They didn't want to look at residential retrofits, they wanted to look at commercial. The problem with landlord tenants, whether it be commercial or residential, is who's going to pay for the retrofit? The landlord doesn't want to put that money in there for the new air conditioner, new heat pump. Why would the tenant ever pay for it? So they're both stuck in this vicious downward cycle where the tenant pays more for electricity than he really ought to. And really, the landlord doesn't have the best rental property to rent. So what we do on our residential side is if both the landlord and the tenant will sign on to it, we'll do it. And that lien on the meter, it's not actually a lien on property, just travels from tenant to tenant to tenant. In the commercial side, where you have strip malls, we do the same thing. And that's the UC Davis study. It's what can you do on the commercial side to make it successful like the residential. I mentioned earlier about an 87% ACSI score that was largely built around test in, test out, and just a history and tradition of worrying about members. We have recently done some testing of the people's homes who we've already worked with under this Doris Duke Foundation. 87% of the members surveyed had the same or higher satisfaction with their co-op than they did a year ago. Nobody was less happy. 92% of participants and non-participants had the same or higher satisfaction with their co-op as a result of being contacted about what we call Help My House. I want to stress, of those people who didn't make the cut, those non-participants, where we went out and tested and you couldn't test it to get to 6.6 years or less, they still felt they'd been dealt with fairly. They believed the thing was not gained. They believe it would work. It's almost impossible to get a 92% on anything. I mean, ice cream would be tough. More than 90% of the members liked how the program was structured. 96% of the participants were satisfied with how the loan was explained to them. Why is that important? Our loan document is 28 pages long. And that's one thing we're working to simplify. But in a need to really make sure that that paperwork explains the process, and that so future home occupants will have the benefit of clear information, that it's long. For 96% of the people to say they weren't bothered by its length, again, a lot of confidence in those co-op people that are explaining it to them. They described the process as easy to understand and complete. 96% of the participants were satisfied with the quality of work that was done on their home. When's the last time a plumber ever had a 96% or an HVAC contractor? In part, this works because in South Carolina we have a co-op mantra. We measure twice and then cut once. You really have to work hard to make sure that you don't put something out there prematurely. So part of what we're doing with the pilot now is we're collecting 350 different fields of data about the home that we retrofit, about the homeowner, about the contractor. We plan on tracking contractor quality. So if a contractor starts to dip, they fall off the approved list. We're tracking attributes of the home, whether it be manufactured housing or whatever else. We want to follow what's going on. We want that certainty just like generation. Second co-op mantra, it costs extra to make water run uphill. And it really does. You need to follow the market stream. And in part, that's one reason why this program works. People need it. You're not having to subsidize something that they're not really sure they want or not. There's self-interest in it. And also self-interest on the part of all the co-op members, even if their homes are not retrofitted. There's something they get out of it. And finally, third mantra, fail fast, fail cheap. And I stress that because you've got to take risk. If you start with why, as the book says now, and look at what you've done successfully, that will usually get you to a new area of success. So as we look back at Hilton Head Island and those African-American farm families, or my father feeding chickens through the cracks in the floor, we're really doing the same thing again. We're just taking the anvil back away. Folks like the program. They like their co-ops. I'm just fortunate I get to be the one that talks about it. But I wish you could go into these co-ops when these loans are processed. We've got a very gruff CEO at Black River Electric Co-op. He's a former Marine jet pilot. And he just kind of curmudgeon. Came to my office one day and said, I'm not going to use the French he used. He said, but I thought there was a revival going on outside my office, church revival. I said, Herb, what's going on? He said, well, they were processing one of these loans, and the lady came out and she was hugging everybody she could find to thank them for this program. It sells itself. We are very proud. We're glad to share. I understand Wisconsin is already starting this same direction with their cooperatives. Midwest Energy in Kansas has done this for a while very, very well. I'm just very hopeful that over the next year or so that the administration and Congress will see fit to find a cost-effective way to invest in energy efficiency. Again, not a rebate, just loaning money. It saves really a lot of expense for the federal government if these people can put money in their pocket. Ours is we call a meter lien or on-bill financing. It's a statutory creature of the state of South Carolina. And what it does, it says if you test in, test out under the state law, you have the right to cut off the electricity for non-payment of the bill. The bill including the structured repayment of the retrofit debt. So the homeowner or landlord tenant agrees up front, I'm gonna pay this back through my electric bill. They cannot receive service if they fail to pay that. But we don't put it on the property. And the reason we don't do that, your real estate agents would prefer that you don't tie up with paperwork. We are required in the state statute to file notice at the courthouse, the county courthouse, that this exists, so that there's notice given to future property owners. Landlords are required to give notice to their future tenants of this existing. The co-op's also required for any new service for a future homeowner to let them know. If the co-op fails to give notice of the meter lien, we're not able to collect on the loan, so there's a real penalty there. If the landlord fails to give notice of the lien existing, he has to pay for 1/2 of the term of the lease's electricity, the payback of the retrofit. Generally, that would be about 6 months worth of paying back the bill, so there's a penalty there.
Yeah, I may have missed this earlier, but I get the payback period you mentioned was actually a little bit less than what you projected on these retrofits. But do you have a number on sort of the average first cost investment in the retrofit?
Sure. The average cost for it's $7,200.
$7,200. Okay.
Now that usually, almost 99% of these homes have their envelope tightened, and that runs around $2,000, $2,000, $2,500. And then you almost always have that element of a heat pump replacement of either strip resistance heat or an older generation heat pump. Generally a heat pump over about 13 or 14 years is going to be a lot more efficient if you replace it. A lot of what we're keying on now is emergency heat pump replacement, using our HVAC contractors to lead them into our funnel. We still require the audits, but we'll replace the heat pump first based upon how we scale it to the home. We'll come back and do the audit and then do the envelope and then test out. And they were looking for something to suggest to the administration in the area of energy efficiency. So we met with Dallas Tonziger and others at USDA, Jim Newby, and we briefed them on what we would really like by way of a loan program. Congressman Clyburn heard about that. He introduced the Rural Energy Savings Plan. That Rural Energy Savings Plan passed Congress, the House of Representatives, excuse me, in September 2010 by a bipartisan vote. It was not taken up on the Senate side. It has been reintroduced in this term. But that not passing, USDA retooled an existing economic development loan program called Red Leg. Previously, Red Leg would not have worked for our residential on-bill financing program. So working through the leadership there at USDA, we were able to, I guess, modify some policies, rules, or whatever to allow this to qualify. We applied in March of 2011 under the new modified appraisal program, and we were awarded that very first loan. We have shared our Red Leg loan application now to a number of co-ops across the country. I know a number of them are applying right now. That loan program has been increased from $740,000 per loan to $1 million per loan. I'm very, very hopeful about one other development, which I hope is coming from USDA. Under Red Leg, the co-op borrows the money and then has to lend it to a third entity. In South Carolina, we call that KW Savings. It's a nonprofit. That lending is the traditional Red Leg model where you're creating economic development not through the cooperative, but through this third entity. You can lend for building a hotel, anything like that. That works, but there's a certain amount of red tape in doing that and expense to do that. USDA, I understand, is in the process right now of releasing a regulation, which I think is held up at OMB, if I remember right, that would allow for direct borrowing by cooperatives from RUS for this program. Just like you can borrow now for lines and poles at the distribution level or build for generation, you could build for what I call negawatts, not megawatts, but these negawatts. You could borrow. I don't believe it'll be 0% interest. I think it's probably going to be Fed funds rate plus an eighth or something like that. But it's still going to have the advantage of being low enough that it won't be that 11 or 12% I was being given by nameless private entities. Rethinking and retooling their business model around this. And they have, not only did we survey our consumers about satisfaction with this program, the numbers I was reading, we survey the contractors, and they're very satisfied with it. The more we do this, the more they learn. And it becomes easier and easier for them to hit those targets and be held accountable by that second audit. But it is a learning curve. In a previous life, I worked as the general counsel to the state senate. And in the 1990s, as in 3 other decades, I was charged with drawing the redistricting maps for South Carolina. And I worked with a very thoughtful chairman who made it his singular goal that South Carolina ought to have its first African-American congressman since Reconstruction. This chairman was very politically adept, so he drew a district that included every incumbent African-American state senator into it, all out of self-interest. Everybody wanted to run. Well, really to no surprise to me, the person that won was not a state senator. It was Jim Clyburn. And the reason he won, he understands that district. When Congressman Clyburn received the 2011 Distinguished Service Award for NRECA, in I guess May of last year, he told a story about growing up in that Sumter area I was talking about earlier. Your dad was a minister and your mom was a hairdresser. And they lived in an area they didn't have running water. One day, they delivered a bathtub to the Clyburn household. It was sitting out in the front yard before they were able to install it. The family was so excited, I think you said they spent the day jumping in and out of that bathtub out in that front yard. He understands these people we were talking about earlier. I was going to tell you about one of his constituents that lives in St. Matthews. Her name is Linda Butler. When we first started this program, we went to each of the 7 media markets in South Carolina and did a Help My House. It was this old house approach where you do the retrofit. And we awarded up to $9,000 in grants to do these, and we filmed it. And we were showing everybody through this TV coverage what you could do in your home. Linda Butler is a single mom in St. Matthews. She is raising her daughter and her granddaughter. She lives in a 1,200 square foot house built in 1971. She makes $20,800 as a Head Start teacher. She tells the story that one month she got her electric bill and it was about $700. She said, Mike, I cried. I cried. I went and got in the bed and cried. When she was notified that she had won this opportunity, she said she did her hallelujah dance. And let me share with you why she was so happy about it. In 2009, that small house, those 3 people living there, used 30,000 kilowatt hours in a year. Now again, that's at 10 cents per kilowatt hour. In 2010, after the retrofit, that home did not use 30,000 kilowatt hours. It used less than 10,000 kilowatt hours. She's saving on her bill, on average, $250 per month. That's $3,000 a year. Think about what that means to her, her grandchild, and her child, compared to that total income of $20,800. When Congressman Clyburn ran for re-election in the last election, he had Linda Butler tell her story. He shared that across the state of South Carolina, still does. In fact, when Congressman Clyburn testified before the U.S. House Agriculture Committee in 2010 about this legislation, he played her story for the committee. Because really is that face and that name that tells the story. That she could save and save that much. There are lots of other things about Congressman Clyburn that you probably already heard about. He is expert at being bipartisan. As the assistant leader now, previously in his role as whip, getting the votes together, he found ways to work across the aisle. Still does. He's a veteran of the civil rights movement. In fact, such a veteran, he met his wife, Emily, in jail. And I'm very proud that he's from South Carolina, Congressman Clyburn.